This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Go to our website at wdtatpodcast.com and click on support to learn how you can be part of this effort to learn how to have better conversations, increase compassion, and build bridges, not walls. You can make a one-time donation or become a patron for as little as $1 a month and receive patron-only benefits. This week's shout-out to our patrons goes to Camille Cody. Thanks for being a patron, Camille, and thanks for supporting the podcast. Now let's get to the interview. Well, when I recorded this interview with my friend Sharyl, we lived in a very different world. We weren't thinking about global pandemics, social distancing, or using Zoom quite as much as we are now. Many of us are sheltering in place and facing restrictions to help slow the spread of this new virus. We are, well, at least I am, at times anxious and fearful about what this means for me and the world. And then other times I'm overwhelmed by the beauty, solidarity, selflessness, creativity, and service that I see. The anxiety and fear has produced very real acts of racism and xenophobia towards Asian Americans. The president has insisted on calling this the Chinese virus. I won't speculate about why he's done that, but I will point out that there are very real-world consequences for using this kind of language, and it's irresponsible when there's clear, neutral language used by most scientists and health professionals. You can also go to Twitter and search the hashtag #IamNotAvirus and read for yourself many of the experiences and stories from those who've experienced racist and xenophobic behavior. I'll also include in the show notes several stories that have been written about these acts, as well as resources for submitting and reporting acts of xenophobia and racism towards Asian Americans. So for some of these reasons and many, many more, I'm very happy to share with you my conversation with Sharyl Loeung today. We do mention Lunar New Year, which has since passed, but it might be a great starting point for you and me to understand our Asian American brothers and sisters a bit better in such a time as this. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
Well, today I think this should be the next episode in a ongoing series, maybe, that I'll call Friends from Seminary, or maybe, hey, this is a good excuse to talk to my friend. Today, my guest is Sharyl Loeung, and she's a friend from our days in seminary and from living in Waco. But she's also the coordinator for outreach and inclusion for multicultural affairs at Baylor University. So welcome to the podcast, Sharyl. It's good to talk to you.
I know. It's good to hear your voice.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic. You know that I'm living in Bolivia with my family, and so we, as a family, I've lived in a couple different countries. My wife has lived in a couple different countries, and we wanted our kids to have that experience because we're not a multicultural family or bicultural family, and so we're pretty white, about as white as it comes. And so I thought it'd be fun to talk to you, both because you work in multicultural affairs and work with lots of different kinds of students, but also because you are in a bicultural family, and I was really interested to hear about your experience. So the first question I have for you is, what did you learn about other cultures growing up? Or it could be even like what you didn't learn, maybe, I don't know. But growing up, what was it like in your family How did you talk about other cultures, or were you exposed to other cultures?
Yeah, that's, it's funny as these questions get asked, the older I get, I feel like there's a broader spectrum to that answer. But, when we say growing up, I feel like I split that into like under 12, over 12 kind of thing. Adolescence is its own beast.
Right.
But I would say as a younger child, very little exposure or conversation. But I grew up in Dallas area, just north of Dallas. So when we talk about the suburbs, just on the tail of Dallas. So to go into Dallas proper would not be unusual. So, it wasn't that diversity wasn't around me. And when I talk about diversity or teach diversity, I talk about diversity as a state of being, just a literal fact of if there are people of difference, then you have diversity, but that doesn't mean that you have any kind of education or acceptance or any of those things. And so I would say that would be probably a good example would be my own upbringing, is that I was around quite a bit of diversity, but that didn't mean that I was somehow more aware or more culturally accepting, or my family was. And one of the things that often causes that is without some sort of education, you tend to have conflict when you drop people into spaces without some sort of preparation. And so there would be, neighborhood conflict related to difference, ethnic difference. And so our neighborhood was rapidly shifting. And so that caused a lot of conversation within my household, and I had grandparents that lived within walking distance, both sets. And so they had been in, the neighborhood for decades and had watched it, quote, shift. And so that was definitely a negative. So yes, that was not how I landed in a positive direction for sure.
Yeah.
Really, for me, playing sports would be one of the ways that I began to make friends that were different ethnicities and races than me, just playing city league sports, because those are based on where you live. Yeah. And so that would have been probably one of the first exposures that were real people in real time. And sports are unifying experiences. So I would say that would be probably by like 10, 11, 12, started making friends that didn't look like me. And then so my parents kept me out of the public school system until high school, 10th grade. I begged and pleaded. And so I still didn't go to the school that was in my neighborhood, but there was the opportunity to go to a school. There was basically a brand new school opened up, and it was open enrollment, and it was further north. And so, but it was very diverse. And so that was when my whole world just shot open, of all kinds of people. And so I think when people think about diversity, they think of, Latinx or Latino, black, white. But for Dallas, we had Pakistani and Ghanaian and Cambodian and Vietnamese and Chinese and El Salvadorian. And it was just very, very diverse. Yeah. Both refugee and first-gen immigrant and fifth-gen immigrant. And so that just completely blew my world open at 16 years old. Yeah. So that, I think, really is where that shifted my worldview dramatically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And what you were saying about your parents and grandparents and kind of growing up in that neighborhood, I think it's a common, that's my experience too, coming from a small town in Texas, that there's like generations where things were kind of a certain way maybe, and people have a certain comfort. And then there's some things that are really nice about that. And I think it's maybe okay to say like, yeah, it's hard for all of us when our comfort gets challenged. Not everybody's maybe got the tools to navigate that when it happens, but people's reactions to like, whoa, this is changing. I don't know what's happening. This is not the neighborhood that I've spent like so many years of my life in. To have maybe sometimes have some compassion for our relatives and ancestors that don't maybe appear in the best light in 2020, but we can kind of recognize like, oh, there are areas where I appreciate comfort and don't want to have to change or be confronted with certain things too. So yeah,
and I mean, they weren't wrong. The crime did increase dramatically, and the school, the academic ratings went down. I mean, all these things were real. But they also didn't get to know their neighbors in the ways that might have explained some of those things. And so when I did end up later getting involved in some of what would be called mission churches, it's not my favorite language, and got to know some of the literally teenagers who were in the gangs and finding out why and how it totally made sense. Their parents had survived war and had horrid PTSD and were not doing well. All these things. Their kids were selling drugs to buy shoes, and I mean, it was just it was systemic, right? But also it made the schools not safe, and so nobody wanted their kids to go to the schools, so they went to the private Catholic school or the private Episcopal school. So we both made sense, and it was just very messy. My parents loved our neighbors who were from Mexico, not first gen, and they would invite us over for their birthday parties and their cookouts, and that was fine. And I think what made that fine is because we got to see them face to face all the time. But they were, the anomaly, quote unquote, because we saw them. They were real people. So,
no, it really,
it's hard.
Yeah, it really shows that, there are stories behind all the people that seem so different to us and come from different cultures that are immigrants. And once we kind of hear their stories and understand them better, a lot of things kind of fall away, a lot of the fear and a lot of those worries. So I want to hear about your story. How did you meet your husband, Roth? And tell me a little bit about him. And then how did you guys fall in love?
Oh, it's so cheesy, Lucas.
That's great. I'm here for it. Let's do it.
So, I mean, we're talking young love here. So I was a member of kind of your stereotypical youth group. We did all the things, and in Dallas, youth groups are typically large. So we would take, when I say large, I mean, we would take 5 chartered buses and more vans to youth camp, kind of large. And we weren't a mega church for Dallas. So very large, predominantly white. I mean, we had a spattering of other cultures, but predominantly white youth group. And I had just grown up as a leader since middle school. I mean, it's just kind of my personality. And as I was really just because of the friendships that I had made and the different types of people and stories that I was hearing in high school, was having a hard time hearing, I think, some of the hardline approaches from the pulpit about types of people. And that meant some of the LGBTQ friends that I had met in high school who were trying to hold on to their faith or figure out what that could mean, and as well as people from other countries, just all kinds of things. And so I was really wrestling at 18, graduating high school with, is it my faith that I'm losing, or is it the church? Where am I? And, I was free to do what I wanted as an 18-year-old, and at least in my parents' culture. And so there was a little ad in the bulletin that the Cambodian mission congregation needed help with their children and youth. And it was a terrifying thought. I don't like doing new things. I'm not a terribly bold person when it comes to just, doing new things. But it just felt like the right thing. And so one of my first friends in high school was Cambodian. And so something about that was attractive to me to just try it out. And I learned some like cultural things. So I literally just like got the address and like walked in. And so when I walked in, there was this handsome young man playing guitar and singing, leading worship. And so I had a joke with my best friend at the time, and we would like text each other and say like, oh, I met the man I'm going to marry today, kind of stuff. And so I texted her and I was like, I met the guy I was going to marry today. And it was true. So, I could have said that like 100 other times, but that time it was real. So, but he was the oldest person who spoke English who had stuck around. And so they had said, here, you're in charge of children and youth. Do something with them. And so, poor guy, was alone with, the 4 and 5-year-olds up to and youth in most congregations. This can be Asian, African. A lot of these sorts of congregations, if you're not married, you're a youth. And so, this is college to literally 4 and 5-year-olds go teach, have them, like for Sunday school and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Make
a youth group. And so, it's humorous because he is now a teacher, so I guess it wasn't the worst experience ever for him. But so he was desperate for help, and then the people who were helping with the congregation who were white, as we were having like leadership team meetings, started trying to hook us up. And so I thought that was like an okay thing. What I would learn later is that they had no idea culturally what they were doing, and so that was not okay with the actual congregation, and so that caused horrid conflict.
Wow. Yeah.
So it seemed okay at the time. But so my husband is incredibly shy. You won't hear many words from him. Lucas knows this. Lucas worked with him before. And so we did youth group stuff through the summer, and I decided we would meet eyes and those sorts of things, and I decided that he was either a creeper or he was into me because he just wasn't really talking to me. And so after a meeting, I like literally shook his hand, and in my hand was a piece of paper that had like my phone number and my AIM ID. And of course, what is the guy who won't talk to? So that night, I get a little AOL ding. And so he asked me out over AOL Instant Messenger.
Wow. Just in case there's any like young people that listen to my podcast that don't, AOL Instant Messenger, this is like early days of the internet. And maybe I'll find a little clip of the ding to play in there for you to add some sound effects to your story.
Yep. So that was that. So that was, and I had just graduated high school, so I was 18 and he was 20. So it's been a minute.
Wow.
So we've been, that dating, if you want to put, a time frame on it, that was 18 years ago. And then we've been married for, 13, I think. This is bad.
I have to do the math too sometimes. It's okay.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
That one's easier. So, yeah.
So it's really interesting, this idea of, first, the thing you said about him, because he was the oldest person in the church. This isn't something I think a lot of people would think about if you don't come from a non-dominant culture in the U.S.
Yeah, this is very common.
Yeah, that he was the oldest person who spoke English, and so he had to help with the youth group because the leaders of the church, I'm guessing, didn't speak English well enough to really lead the children who are like next generation that are speaking maybe more English than Cambodian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
And I just, that's something I wanted to highlight, that is a thing you don't think about in churches. Oh, you're the oldest person that speaks English. Well, we need you to help with the kids because all of the leaders in the church can't help with the kids.
Yeah, and honestly, at 20, he was lucky. He was older. We would go on to work, and maybe we could talk about this at some point, but work all over the state of Texas, actually helping, consulting with churches like that church.
Yeah.
And training leaders like him. And many of them were 15, 16 years old.
Wow.
And they were in charge of children's ministries.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, the other thing I want to hear more about is this conflict. So your friends that were, your white friends that were working with you guys obviously saw a connection and, you know, in U.S. culture thought, oh yeah, well, we just need to get them together. And
push it along.
You know? And so what was the conflict then with the congregation and with Cambodian culture? And then how did that like play out?
Yeah. So, this will unpack multiple things in church life for you. So these were, and when we say friends, these were people that were, my parents' age and older that, and I will use this in a kind way, but also in a way that I think will give you a picture. It was a very paternalistic relationship with the congregation. That, you know, they can't do church on their own. So that was very common that they need help.
Yeah.
And so you have people who were in their 40s and 50s and 60s, a few couples who had been there for a very long time. And so I was frustrated because I felt like they really should have known better. But who would be there to guide and plan and do things, and they would roll in and out depending. I mean, they weren't always the same people, but some had been there for some time, and sometimes they were the pastor, and I think at this time, one of them was the pastor and would preach, and then someone was translating for them, so they weren't even using internal leadership. So, and it wasn't because it was someone that had like a seminary degree or anything like that was preaching. It was just someone who was like a deacon in the larger white congregation that they felt like had knowledge, and so was preaching. And then it was being translated. And so, they just thought it was cute and innocent. And so for the congregation, I mean, there are multiple things. I had just gotten there. So who are you?
Right.
Roth was kind of the golden child.
Okay.
He's, on one hand, he was still going to church. So many his age had left the church. Not all. I mean, there was a good little group of guys at that point, but many of their children had not retained church involvement. Some of that had to do with not having the English component. Some of it had to do with his generation really struggled with gang life and imprisonment, even if you had passed away due to violence. So women with teen pregnancy and things. And so, because they were the ones who came over as younger children. And so, and they were coming straight out of refugee camps. So, I mean, we're talking about a not simple transition into American culture.
Right.
Learning English, you know, first-ish grade. So, certainly more Americanized than Cambodian, but also a tough transition. And so, so that was one piece. He was also just so incredibly intelligent. I think they just had big plans for him. And there was such a fear that I was going to steal him away, wherever away was going to be. And then it just was just suspicion and needing more time and
Yeah.
generally speaking, maybe just not done the right way in terms of him kind of introducing me and asking just layers upon layers of how it went down.
We don't think about.
But I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Right. We're often.
And he didn't either, honestly, until he made some of the mistakes.
Right. But I'm just imagining when you come from a dominant culture where you have those privileges to not think about so many things. You're not in a mode of like protecting your own culture most of the time, or having to think about like, okay, we're here, but we have this struggle between maintaining some of our cultural identity and fitting into this different culture. And so we don't even think about it. And so things happen. And I imagine in conversations too, people think, wow, what's the big deal? Why do people get so upset or offended, right? Or respond the way that they do? But that's often because we don't have to think about what it means for other people to try and like protect what they have and the fear of losing it,
Yeah, you're talking about people who lost literally 20 million of their population to genocide, and then flee the country and are scattered everywhere. And so, it was, at 18 years old, I did not have this kind of insight, but
right.
Or wisdom. But now I do understand that the language lost. Our children won't really be bilingual just because they need to be hearing it in better conversation. And so, that's a cultural loss. They're getting food, they're getting, they will certainly get history. But, that's a big deal. And so, there's some that can accept that and some that can't now. And I understand in a different way, certainly, than I did then. And so it took me about 5 years to gain acceptance within the congregation. So that's just a lot of sticking with it. And it really had to do with not so much Roth, but being really, really faithful with their kiddos. And in the middle of like some really hard situations and just continuing to show up for their students. And so it just became obvious that I wasn't going anywhere, that I was there to be a part of the community and learn custom and learn as much as I could. And so it wasn't, everyone for sure, but yeah, it was probably it was a 5-year scenario. The college students were great. They were amazing. And so supportive and helpful. Kids don't care. They just want somebody to play with. Yeah. But, as far as the older congregation, it was about 5 years.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, tell me a little bit about you guys get married and then you have this long relationship, almost 2 decades now. We're all getting older, Sharyl. I'm sorry.
I know, it's terrible when you said that.
I know. I felt it in myself too, because we're not too far apart in age. But in your relationship with Roth, like what were the cultural things that were difficult or that you had to kind of figure out and work through that maybe you wouldn't have noticed before, or that you wouldn't have had if it wasn't a relationship that had that cultural component?
Yeah, it's hard for me to say just because I think any culture, I think even if I had married someone who looked just like me, technically could have had these things, but
sure.
I do know that these things are culturally tied, so I can speak to them. It's really communication styles, just a real embedding of kind of a non-confrontational, like if there's a conflict, then you just leave it be, or, which, I know white people who do the same thing.
Right.
That isn't my personal style, and so that was difficult.
That's not the dominant style for white people, I would say.
No. And some of it too is, and I know Cambodians who can get very verbal, and bring up, things from the past. I mean, I've seen some of that, but there's more, okay, so we'll go with this. So I guess stereotypical female Cambodian is going to nag and nag and nag and nag until they get their way. And so it doesn't take, it's not as bad as it used to be by any means, but it wouldn't take much of me kind of like reminding like once or twice for it to be triggering.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense? To sort of create a shutdown of like, I'm 15 years old and I'm not listening to you because this is what I do. Like when my mom starts reminding me to do something, like, or my grandma, or because it becomes a chorus,
right?
Because it's communal,
right?
So, everybody has free reign to like get on anybody's kids. So I mean, you could be at a house, and suddenly you've got 8 women who are like, why aren't you taking pre-cal, or where are you going to college, or you need to get, And so it would just sort of like this ingrained tendency that like we just shut those things out. And so it could be like a legitimate conversation of frustration, but it's like immediately shut out, and just this really amazing ability to not literally not hear those things. And so it's taken a while to be like, no, like this is I actually want a response. Yeah. Versus like in that situation, you respond and that's very like, it's disrespectful and it's not going to go well for you. And you just take it and like let it be. Like, no, this is like a thing. I want to hear back from you. Yeah. So that would have been a pretty big one of like, this is not me berating you to get like, stress out, and then you walk away and act like you never heard it and do whatever you're going to do anyway, because you've been taken back to your, teenage years or something. Yeah. So that was a big one. But also then I had to think about like tone and setting and those sorts of things of like how I set up those conversations of, okay, can we talk? Like that. Yeah. So that would be probably a really good example.
It's so interesting that I have other friends too who are in bicultural relationships, and it's hard enough being in relationships and trying to be healthy and work on a marriage, long-term committed relationship, and not have all these other layers that you have to unpack. And you kind of said this at the beginning of your answer, that it's hard sometimes to tease out what is it that's personality, and then what is it that's culture. Yes. And those aren't always separate either, right? They're kind of like all mixed up together, but sometimes we might like, if we perceive that it's like a cultural thing, we'll give a little more perhaps like benefit of the doubt or whatever. But then sometimes it can go either way, right? Like then sometimes, well, no, that's really personality, and that's something that somebody needs to work on. That's their personality and not just like cultural. So you also work a lot with multicultural students at yes. Baylor. So when you're working with them, and there's a whole lot of different cultures like interacting and clashing, and maybe there's conflict at times. Do you have any advice or stories about teasing out the difference between personality and culture?
Yeah, I mean, for me, probably where it comes up more in my work is talking to students who are in conflict with their parents. So I was having this conversation with someone yesterday that I've been doing kind of this multicultural student work for probably about 15 years now, in different settings. And so some of the things that I've learned is that I have to really watch for one, I have to be careful because I will know things that are common in cultures, but I can't, for one, the student doesn't necessarily know that. And so I can't be like, oh, well, that's cultural, because they're like, who are you to say?
Yeah.
So I have to sit back and kind of play dumb. And
here comes the white lady explaining culture to everybody else. Right. Yeah.
So I mean, there are certain students that know me very well and that those conversations go different directions.
Sure.
But,
yeah.
I have to be really, really careful that I don't sit on those 15 years, because for a student who's new, it's 0 years. And so, that's a really big thing in my work. But, one thing that I will say, which is going backwards just a little bit, Lucas, but it has been really important to me to hear culture versus personality when it comes to abusive situations. And so knowing like no culture should accept certain things. And so really hearing, and granted, I'm fortunate enough now, this wasn't always the case, that I'm not working with minors. It was much harder when it was with minors. So now it's more with like dating relationships and with parents that, I understand that this is common. I understand that this is what you've grown up with, but you don't have to continue to take verbal lashings.
Right.
You're now 20 years old and you can start to set some boundary, like have those conversations. And yes, there may, and what I have to say is, and they will say, but understand this will happen, this will happen, they may cut me off or they're not going to talk to me. I'm like, yeah, I understand there's consequences. And then I can tell them some of the things that have happened, in our own life of, we've had to set some, boundaries with, my in-laws, and it may mean that they don't call us for 6 months because they're so angry. But that eventually it works its way out because it was, it was really important that's, a certain behavior just couldn't continue for us to be in an okay place, or there was something that needed to change for us to feel okay, and without getting into all of that. But and so some of it is doing some boundary work, but also understanding that looks different in different cultures and it has to be approached differently than I would approach it. But that there are still, it doesn't mean, and I think this is what students or people struggle with, is because they go to, say, a boundary workshop and it's taught by the majority and it's so far away from anything that could relate to their family that they're like, I can't do this. And so then they don't set any boundaries because it's not relatable at all. And so for me, I mean, boundaries is just an example, but I think it's a pretty strong one, of, okay, within your context, there are ways for you to still do this. It's just got to look different. But that doesn't mean that you never have any boundaries for the rest of your life, or you never get to, whatever it might be, challenge certain norms in your family, that doesn't have to stay that way forever, or that you, when you raise your own kids, that you don't get to change some of these things. Those sorts of conversations. Because unfortunately, when they're getting these kind of developmental workshops from majority culture, they're sometimes just so unrelatable. Does that help a little bit?
I think that's really helpful. One thing you said that really stuck out to me, especially as like coming from a dominant culture, from the white culture, this idea of not resting on our past experiences. It could also go for any other cross-cultural thing. So, I mean, I have friends here that are from Dominican Republic, and they've worked all over South America, and it could be a similar situation. Anytime you're doing cross-cultural work, there sometimes is a temptation to feel this feeling of like, well, I understand Latino culture, or I've had this many years. You mentioned your 15 years working in it, and there is that temptation to say like, to want our experience to be validated, I think, is part of where that comes from.
Yeah.
But when you're approaching new people or new situations, they may be similar, and you may even you might even be right, but to approach it fresh and not as with the attitude of like, well, I've been here and done this before, let me tell you how it is. Anytime you are the outside party from the culture that you're approaching, not resting on your past experiences and still being open to learning and understanding, because it's a new group, and sometimes it plays out in different ways, and there are some stereotypes that or trends or whatever you want to call it, characteristics, but every group, it's going to be different. It's going to play out different. They're not.
Yeah, I consider those 15 years just tool building, so I may be quicker.
Yeah, there you go.
Come to a solution, but
or notice. You might be quicker to notice things or hear things that people are saying more quickly than if you didn't have previous experience. Yeah.
You've just learned listening skills and learned kind of how some things might play out. But yeah, it's just, I've just been blown away, even just in the last year, some of the stories I've heard, and it's like, nope, haven't heard that one. So
yeah,
you just don't know.
Yeah,
you just really don't know where people are coming from till you hear their story.
Okay, I really want to ask you this question, because as a multicultural family, I imagine you get asked, living in Bolivia, having two daughters that have red hair means they get a lot of attention, and so they don't get as much attention in the U.S., but I imagine, it has sort of good and bad sides to it. But I imagine as a multicultural family, you hear things that I can't imagine, questions or so what are the weirdest or the most difficult things that people have said to you or asked you related to your family?
Oh, yeah, there's a few. So when I had only one son, and here's the thing, people talk about like pregnancy dreams, and you dream about things, and I would feel guilty because I would dream about a white baby, and I think it's because your whole life that's what you probably see, and so I had to kind of just get over the fact that my brain was just doing what it was doing.
Yeah.
And then I wasn't, evil. And so then my first son was born, and he, as people would say, didn't look, quote unquote, mixed at all. He carried far more, we'll say, Asian characteristics in general. And so it was difficult because people say, oh, he just looks like his dad, or he looks so much like his dad. Which is kind of true. Sure. But also it feels more like it has to do with skin tone, because his, like the shape of his face, and he actually looks a lot like my sister, like the shape of his head and some of the other things. So it was just, I would get, things about like where he was from or where we got him from, which was the assumption that, like I had adopted him from somewhere. Right. When I just had him. And that happened mostly at Baylor, which makes sense because it's this Christian context where adoptions, there's actually some Truett staff. Yeah. So, yeah. And so I think there's just people who are like honed into this like adoption concept, and so maybe saw me as the type who would like go and adopt from another country or something. But and so I was so floored. I think I said he was mine, and then later I started saying he was from my uterus, because I was just like thought that if I could shock back, it would end the conversation because it was so weird. But then my second born has blonde curly hair, brown eyes, but blonde curly hair, and so people will be like, oh, well, he looks like you, and then the other one. And we found a picture just a week or two ago of Roth at maybe second grade, and it was striking how much the face looks, that they look alike. So it's just interesting how hard it is for people to see past the skin tone.
Yeah.
For like features. And I will say that, I see some of both in both. I don't think either looks exactly alike, but they now together, I would say they do look very different from each other. And so I do understand the whole like, oh, they're brothers, because it is hard. When people will ask like, how did that happen? Like, genetics. It's just
where do I start?
It's something we know, and I usually will give an example of like, oh, there have been twins born where one's black and one's white. This is a thing. I try to like, this isn't that weird,
right?
But
we get that. We get that in my family because my two daughters have red hair. I don't have red hair, and my wife doesn't have red hair. And no one in our immediate family has red hair on either side.
It's called a recessive gene.
Yeah, like I understand how that works, but we used to get questions all the time about, I love their hair, it's so pretty. Like who in your family has the red hair, or where does their red hair come from? That's what people would ask. Where does their red hair come from? And for a while, especially early on, we would say things like, well, there's some questions we just don't ask. Or we would say like, well, we used to have a redheaded mailman, or, just weird things to throw people off, because like you said, like it's kind of like really, if you know very little about genetics, it's not that hard to imagine. Like, we're white people, and somewhere we have like Irish and Scottish ancestors and recessive genes that come on down and they pop out, so we got red hair.
Yeah. The only way, because my mom kept having this thing about like one of them could have blue eyes, and I was like, that's the one thing that would bring up some like serious questions about like some missionary in Cambodia, which she never really like got the joke, but that would be the one that would be like, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Because I kept saying, I don't think we're gonna get blue eyes, Mom.
Yeah, right. Because you don't have blue eyes, and Roth doesn't have blue eyes, so yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And so there shouldn't be blue eyes anywhere in his family that we know of.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So it's maybe we can start wrapping up, I guess.
Sure.
This has been really fun talking to you. I don't really want to wrap up, but is there anything else before maybe we do the last questions? Anything else that you want to share about having like working with multicultural students and being part of a multicultural family? Anything you want to talk about or share, stories that you have?
I will say, and I'm at a private school, college, so I would say that it's becoming, even there, and I would assume the state school is even more so seeing it, but that demographically we're watching the increase of students who are checking multiple races. And student services haven't quite figured out what that means in terms of any kind of adjustments that might be needed, because we still do very affinity group-based services. And so we are starting to see more students who don't necessarily want to pick or know how to pick.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important for people who work really with kiddos from, kindergarten all the way up, to realize that, I went to my son's Christmas party, and I had no idea how many of his friends were biracial, or at least biracial. And so, it's a changing demographic. And so I think our programming and services and education is going to have to change, and language will need adapting around those things, because it won't be so unique, in the coming years at all. And so ways to do a better job of serving that population of children and students as we move forward, and giving certainly better language for them will be, I think, important, because that identity development, that is certainly a place where we see some of the identity crisis, is they feeling like they're caught in the middle, and that certainly shouldn't be the case.
Right.
So,
right. I mean, it kind of reveals the whole flaw in the system of naming races and having boxes to check anyways. But that's I mean, that is a whole other episode that maybe we can do another time. And I do hope to unpack race a lot more on the podcast, because there's just so much there. Well, to wrap up, I have 2 questions for you and me to answer. So something that we want to recommend for people to do, an action step. I like to give people something to do in response. And then something that we want to share, a recommendation, a book, movie, another podcast, whatever. And I'll go first so you can have a little time to think about it. Something that we can do, when you were sharing about work, this feeling of being drawn to the Cambodian congregation, and it was maybe a little bit outside of your comfort zone at the time. I was thinking about times that I have done similar things. When we were in seminary, there was a sign in the hall, several signs about a meeting to start a Black student union at Truett Seminary, and I don't know why exactly, but I just said I decided to go and show up and be a part of it, and they were very happy to have me and welcoming and included me, and I learned a lot just from hanging out with a lot of the both African American and African students that we had at the seminary, and I don't know that everybody has that experience all the time of feeling drawn to cross those boundaries, because it is difficult. I've had other experiences in my life that I think maybe made that easier for me at that moment, but I know that not everybody, some people, that's very scary. That would be a very anxiety-inducing idea to be a white person and go to the Black Student Union to participate and be there, right? So I want to encourage people to look in your community for groups that are multicultural groups, or maybe just that are a different culture from your own, and get involved. It is hard sometimes to take that first step, but I guarantee you that they are usually very, very welcoming and happy to have people interested in their culture that are from outside of their culture, because they all know kind of what it's like to be African American or to be Latino in the U.S. And to have the chance to share that with other people outside of the culture, man, that's a great feeling. And my experience has always been that those groups are very, very welcoming. So I would encourage people to take a deep breath, and if it's hard for you, take the plunge and find a group that you can connect with, and maybe you have friends that are diverse that can help be the entry point. And I was somebody who was willing to just go and jump in, and not necessarily have somebody introducing me around, but maybe you have somebody that can be that gateway into a different community. So that would be my action step. And then I want to recommend another podcast that I listened to recently that you may be aware of, and I've had multiple people recommend it. In fact, I think another guest recommended it to me, and then our friend Jeff Holcomb said he was listening to it on a road trip, and I said, okay, I will listen to it. It's by Scene on Radio, which is a documentary series from Duke University, and they did a series called Seeing White. That was unpacking race and whiteness. And I think it's very, very helpful as we're talking about engaging across cultures to understand, like you were sharing somewhat at the end there about the boxes that we've made to check and why we have those boxes, where they came from, and how they affect the way that we engage, especially as white people, other cultures. I just found it super helpful, and we're often talking about race from the perspective of other races, not white. And so it's great to have it kind of flipped from the perspective of what is whiteness? Where did it come from? What does it mean? How does it affect us? So I'll have a link to that in the show notes, and I highly recommend that series. Sharyl, what do you have for us? Something that we can do and something that you want to recommend to people? Could be anything, really. What do you love?
You had some really good ones, yeah. So, I mean, something that you could do, you took some really good ones there. So,
sorry.
I know. I'm gonna hone in a little bit on something you can do.
Yeah. And
then maybe add one. So Chinese or Lunar New Year is actually next Saturday, or starts next Saturday. And so since I was speaking more to some of those specifics, so that might be if you feel overwhelmed by everything that Lucas gave you, maybe that'll give you one entry point. And so if you're near a city, there are typically celebrations for several weekends, and they're very cool. And usually there's food and just entertainers and all kinds of stuff. But on top of that, I would say that either if you're going to one of those events or if you can't get to one of those events, is to do some research. Because instead of just, not to say going isn't enough, because I think even the exposure is something, but it won't be enough for you to understand the why. And so I do encourage people not to just be voyeurs of other cultures, but to begin to take in some of the why. And so, for instance, a lot of people other than Chinese celebrate Chinese New Year, but not every Asian that you will meet or Asian culture or country celebrates Chinese New Year or is on that calendar. So Cambodians are actually, their New Year's in April. So, something that you can read about, learn about, and then maybe something you can do as well is that when you're having a conversation with someone and they say something a little silly, you could say, actually, that's not right. I did a little wiki reading the other day, and did you know that fortune cookies were made in the U.S.? Those sorts of things, just to help destigmatize, but also get some of the stereotypes that are floating around, because it is the work of the majority to do that educating of their ignorant and even innocently ignorant friends. And so that's some work that you can begin to do. Is to just the little things, because those can be really hurtful microaggressions, even though they seem silly to you, maybe. And so the more you're educated, the more you can tell your friends, like, seriously, dude, that's not even true. And it's so simple for you to say, and it's so much harder for someone from that culture to get into. So that would be kind of my something to do. And, pick a culture. But that was on my mind just because that is next weekend. And again, if you're near a city, and not always even a city, but just do some Googling, you might be able to find some fun celebrations. So, and then something to share. So I feel like I always have to share my friend's book, Kathy Kong, Khang. She wrote a book a couple of years ago, came out, called Raise Your Voice. That's pretty cool way for people to understand, if you're of the Christian faith, what it means to read scripture through the lens of someone who's coming from a non-white perspective. And so I think we're so used to Bible studies and Sunday school materials and such that read from that kind of Western first world sort of perspective. And so she writes as a really intelligent preacher and teacher from a Korean American background, call her 1.5 generation. And she goes through both Esther and how it relates really well to cross-cultural relations.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can learn about cross-cultural relations. You can learn about what it looks like to read scripture kind of from this different lens, but also she talks a lot about just her own journey and trying to navigate the world as a person of color and a woman of color. So you get kind of a 3-for-1 and a not giant book, a nice narrative book. So it's called Raise Your Voice. It's Kathy with a K, last name Khang. It's IVP, InterVarsity Press.
Cool. Yeah.
So yeah, that'll kind of knock out a few things. And then also, sort of shameless plug, but at Baylor there's another podcast, Lucas probably knows about this, called The Good Neighbor.
Yeah.
From something we're called the Good Neighbor Project. And so the Good Neighbor, as in, Sikkim bears. It's on iTunes. You can Google it. But there are story after story from all kinds of students from diverse backgrounds. So if stories is a good way for you to start, which I think it always is, click away and just hear different experiences from people who have lived all kinds of lives from all kinds of places. There's certainly other podcasts that do that,
sure.
But if for some reason student life is your niche, then that would be a good one.
Yeah. Well, and since you shared a second one, you made me think, when you mentioned fortune cookies, it made me think of, there's a documentary, and I'm not remembering exactly the name, but I'll make sure I get it right and have a link in the show notes. I think it's it's about like General Tso's chicken or something. It's like, but it's this great documentary about Chinese food in the U.S. and how it came to be what it is and where it all came from.
I know what you're talking about. I didn't know. I couldn't tell you the name.
It's a really good documentary, but it helped. As we're talking about these things myths that we have about other cultures or things that we think are true or we just don't know. It's a great, great documentary unpacking where all of that comes from. That's not very authentic Chinese food. So, I'll find the name and put it in the show notes. Yeah.
Very good.
Sharyl, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today and sharing your story and your insights and wisdom from all of your life experience and work with different people and different cultures. Tell Roth hi and your awesome kids hi. And thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's just been fantastic to hear stories that I didn't know and all the insights that you shared. So thank you.
All right, y'all have a fun weekend. I'll think of you Monday as I'm not in work.
Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?
vaya bien.